62 years ago, 9 Russian hikers died in the Ural Mountains. Their official cause of death was listed as hypothermia, not an unusual problem in Siberia in February, and the case was closed by Soviet authorities. So, why discuss a seemingly unremarkable tragedy that happened more than 6 decades ago? You'll find out. The Ural mountain range runs from the north to the south of the western Siberian plains, forming a conventional boundary between Asia and Europe. This mountain range is the setting of our story today, on a mountain called Kolat-Syakhl, or Olechel. Translating to Dead Mountain from Mansi, the language of the people indigenous to this region, this mountain's name comes from the lack of game for hunting. But in February of 1959, this mountain's name would take on a very different meaning. January 1959. In Soviet Russia, a group of 8 young men and 2 young women, nearly all students at the Urals Polytechnic Institute, prepare to hike through the Urals in the dead of winter. Most are preparing to graduate, but before that, they want to do one last hike. One that would raise them from the grade 2 hiker classification they all carried to grade 3, the highest possible at the time. Their leader was 23-year-old Igor Dyatlov, a radio engineering student that would soon graduate from university. In the weeks leading up to the group's departure, Dyatlov's mother would beg him to not go. However, Dyatlov insisted, promising that it would be his last hike. His mother, though displeased, relented. She didn't know it then, but her son would make good on his promise, though not in the way she had wanted. On January 23, 1959, Dyatlov left Yekaterinburg, accompanied by Semyon Zolotaryov, a World War II veteran, and fellow students Ludmila Dubinina, Yuri Krivonishenko, Rustem Slobodin, Alexander Kolevatov, Yuri Yudin, Yuri Doroshenko, Zeneta Kolmogorova, and Nikolai Thibault-Brignol. Armed with journals and cameras to document their trip, the group set off on what should have been a 16-day journey. The group traveled by train to Ivdel on the 25th, and on January 26th, they continued the journey by truck to Vizhai, a small village located in the District 41 logging site. The ride lasted 3 hours, and when they arrived, the group purchased some bread and rested for the night, determined to save up their energy for the 190-mile-long hike ahead of them. Their path would take them through 2 mountains. The first, Kolat-Syakhl, followed by Mount Otorten, their destination. The plan was to then retrace their steps to Vizhai, where, around February 12th, Dyatlov was to send a telegram to his sport club to assure them that they were all alive and well. But on the road to Vizhai, Yuri Yudin began experiencing a flare-up of sciatica. He likely contemplated turning back at Vizhai, but instead chose to push forward to accompany his friends and see the hike through. He left Vizhai with the group on January 27th, and they began their journey through the Urals. But on January 28th, Yudin made the decision to turn back and return home. Sciatica had led to knee and joint pain, rendering it difficult, if not impossible, for him to push forward. He turned back to return to Vizhai and then to make the trip home alone. The other 9 members continued onward without him. At Vizhai, they had all written that they were leaving civilization behind, but this was not entirely correct. The group was unlikely to know of at least one gulag sitting not far off their trail. Over the course of their trip, the group kept detailed journals and took photos, documenting everything. The day after Yudin left, the group's journals state that they started late and covered just 2.5 miles, likely due to the added weight of the gear Yudin had left them with upon his departure. The weather that day made visibility low, but the group pushed forward, choosing to ascend Kolat-Syakhl to avoid losing even more ground. They had ditched some excess gear at the base of the mountain, perhaps planning to collect it on the way back, but this would never happen. They set up camp on the mountain's slope, determined not to lose ground, but likely needing to stop as the sun sank lower. Based on their journals, the trip seemed to be going well in spite of the delays. Back at home, their families continued on with their lives, waiting for the telegram that should arrive around February 12th. But the 12th came and went, and there was no word from the hikers. No one was concerned by this at first. Dyatlov and the others were experienced hikers and were very well prepared for a dangerous trek. The path they were taking was treacherous, and the weather in Siberia in February is equally as dangerous. They were likely slowed down. They were probably being cautious. Or perhaps the telegram just hadn't arrived, and they were already on their way back home. But 8 days passed, and still no word from the hikers. Delays were expected, of course, but over a week? On February 20th, a search party was arranged for and sent up to trace their path and find them. They arrived the following day and set out from Vijay, just as the hikers had nearly a month prior. A few days later, they found their campsite, but things were not as expected. Tracks of footprints, most without socks or shoes, led away from the tent, which had been cut open from the inside with a knife. The rescue teams debated over whether the tent was unfastened or not, but all agreed that the snow was blown onto the tent after their escape and was unlikely to be the result of a blizzard. Over the course of 3 months and an extensive investigation of the area, all 9 members of the group were eventually found, dead in the snow in various states of undress, but none wearing the gear necessary to survive outside in temperatures of around -25 to -30 degrees Celsius. They first found Krivonishenko and Doroshenko, both covered in cuts, dried blood, and burned. Doroshenko had a gray foam on his cheeks, indicating a pulmonary edema. Krivonishenko was missing the tip of his nose and a chunk of his knuckle, which was found later in his mouth. Dyatlov was found around 300 meters away from them, closer to the tent than the second fire they had built. He was missing a tooth, and blood had dried on his lips. He had a few minor cuts and bruises, like Doroshenko and Krivonishenko. Kolmogorova was found face down in the snow, up the hill from the cedar tree under which the remains of a fire and Doroshenko lie. Kolmogorova was better dressed than the boys and had a few minor cuts and bruises, but unlike them, she also had bruises on the right side of her torso that indicated she'd been hit by something. A baton, perhaps. Slobodin was found on March 5th, 1959, his body located somewhere between Kolmogorova's and Dyatlov's. He was only wearing one boot, and he, like the others, had some minor cuts and bruises. His skull was fractured, though it was later determined that it was not a severe enough injury to have been the cause of his death. The last 4 hikers, Kolevatov, Zolotaryov, Thibault-Brignol, and Dubinina, were found in May, when the pass began to thaw. Their bodies were located in a 6-foot ravine. Kolevatov had a broken nose and his eyes were missing. He and Zolotaryov were found embracing, possibly to stay warm. Zolotaryov's chest had been crushed, and he was holding a pen and an empty sheet of paper in one hand. Thibault-Brignol was lying nearby and better dressed for the weather than the others. He suffered from fractures to his skull, and there was a hemorrhage on his arm, and his injuries were significant enough that an accidental fall was immediately ruled out as the cause. Dubinina was nearby as well, and her case was possibly the strangest. Her chest had been crushed, and her eyes and tongue were missing. Later, an autopsy revealed that there was blood in her stomach. Traces of radiation were also found on her and Kolevatov's clothes, but not on any of the others. All but Dubinina, Zolotaryov, and Thibault-Brignol were thought to have died from hypothermia. These explanations were not enough for the public, and for 60 years, conspiracy theories circulated, debating how exactly these 9 hikers died. The case wasn't quite cold, it had been closed. In February 2019, exactly 6 decades after what had been named the Dyatlov Pass incident, the Russian government reopened the case, determined to discover the truth. This promise pleased the public at the time, who had been unsatisfied by the conclusion drawn by Soviet investigators, which claimed that the, quote, spontaneous power of nature, end quote, was what took the lives of the 9 hikers. They never clarified what the unknown compelling force cited in the conclusion was, and this is partly what inspired the theories on the tragedy to begin with. For nearly 5 decades, the government had allowed the public to spin rumors of what had occurred that cold February night. There was a lot to unpack as well. 400 pages of case notes, and an impressive minimum of 23 unique theories on what had occurred, to be specific. A representative of the Russian Prosecutor General assured the public that only 3 theories, deemed the most likely ones by investigators and experts, would be explored, exactly 20 less than those documented and listed by Teodora Hadziska, an expert on the incident. In July of 2020, the investigators announced their conclusion. An avalanche had led the hikers to flee their tents suddenly, with inadequate clothing and in low visibility. The cause of death for all 9 hikers was hypothermia. And here's where the story ends. If you've been paying attention, you've likely noticed several inconsistencies in this story. And of course, there are bound to be inconsistencies. There were no witnesses, no members of the group survived, and it took 3 months to find all 9 bodies. There's no possible way to get a complete, accurate picture of the events that occurred that February night in 1959. So, remember the causes of death for Kolevatov, Zolotaryov, Thibault-Brignol, and Dubinina? Soviet authorities claimed in 1959 that their causes of death were not hypothermia, but instead related to their mysterious injuries. So why did the Russian investigators say in 2020 that they, like their friends, had died of hypothermia? Where did the radiation come from? Was it really an avalanche? An avalanche is a reasonable explanation, I suppose. They were hiking in the Urals, a mountain range in Siberia, in February. So that makes sense, right? Not really. Remember that they were all very experienced hikers, and they kept quite detailed accounts of what had occurred up to the night of February 1st. They had noted that there was fairly thin snow cover, and because Kholat Syakhl isn't a very large or steep mountain, avalanches aren't super common. There was also not enough snow on top of the tent, according to those on the rescue mission, but this doesn't quite rule out the avalanche theory. Strong winds are common in the area they had pitched their tent, and could have carried off the evidence of one. But even if an avalanche had happened, destroying their tent and burying them under several feet of snow, would a group of experienced hikers exit their tent in such cold weather without sufficient clothing or shoes, knowing that the cold was more likely to kill them? And if an avalanche had caused their injuries, would 3 people with significant chest injuries be able to descend easily and without help, as all members of the group had done based on their footprints? Theories include Arctic hysteria, ball lightning, methanol poisoning, and accidental consumption of poisonous mushrooms to explain what had happened that night. But Arctic hysteria only affects natives to a region, not passing hikers, and no autopsy report references the latter two, even if their behavior in their escape could be consistent with methanol poisoning in particular. Pulmonary edema, burns, bleeding from the mouth, and the 4 dead in the ravine are certainly consistent with ball lightning, an unexplained electrical phenomenon that lasts far longer than a typical bolt of lightning, but it's quite rare in cold weather. Some suspect that the 4 in the ravine were actually flung by an explosion caused by ball lightning, leading to their unexplained injuries, though the original investigation provided no evidence of any sort of lightning strikes. Another option is methanol poisoning, and this has some physical evidence to back it up. The amount of urine in Dyatlov's bladder could indicate kidney failure, and there was a flask found amongst the group's belongings that, based on the smell, had been filled with some sort of alcohol, but none of the search team could figure out exactly what type of alcohol it was. The group did not use dry alcohol tablets, and they had no methanol for the stove. They only used wood, so the methanol would have had to be in one of their flasks. According to some, the stove could have been the cause of the burns on some group members. Perhaps after cooking, the stove had reignited, leading to smoke inhalation and some mild burns. This could also lead to the members slashing open the tent to hurriedly escape, and would also explain the blood and burns. But again, would that make experienced hikers cut open their shelter rather than simply unfastening it to let out the smoke? Would that lead them to flee into the night, half-dressed and barefoot? Searchers found the stove unassembled, and there was no cooked food in the tent. The group had alcohol but no empty bottles, and this theory does make the argument that some were intoxicated, so that part at least can be debunked. Some theorists reject these theories and suggest that a wolverine or a yeti, called a menk by the Mansi, was the cause. But the yeti theory seems to be more fabrication by cryptozoologists for a television program than rooted in actual fact. A wolverine is a possibility, but it's unlikely that a wolverine's secretion could have evenly coated the faces and hands of the hikers, much less that it would be enough to discolor their faces and hands, as was noted at the funerals by Kolevatov's sister. It does explain the hurried escape from the tent, followed by their leisurely pace down the slope of the mountain, and the construction of a second fire, though. Some injuries could have been caused by the wolverine, and it does explain the note by a pilot that the search dogs didn't want to exit the helicopter during the search, but again, there are a lot of gaps in this theory. Other theories state that the hikers did have an altercation on the pass, but not with an animal. One theory is a conflict with the Mansi, the group indigenous to the region, but the Mansi have no problem with people hiking through the mountain range. No other hikers that had previously gone through that region had been killed by the Mansi, and there are no sacred places surrounding Kholat Syakhl, So this disproves the black magic witchcraft and the killing on account of disturbing a religious altar. There was also nothing stolen from the hikers or their tent, and the Mansi could have easily made them disappear with their knowledge of the area. So this rules out the Mansi as having hunted and killed the hikers. Others state that perhaps someone had escaped the gulag nearby, but again, their equipment wouldn't have been left untouched, and none of the hikers, particularly the women, bore any injuries that would have been consistent with the behavior expected of an escapee, though some of their injuries do consist with a physical altercation, such as the bruise on Komolgorova's torso. Others suspect they could have been mistaken for gulag fugitives or killed in a cleanup operation, supported by a piece of clothing called an obmatoki found amongst the belongings of the hikers. Yuri Yudin, the member that had turned back, discovered it among the evidence and said that it had belonged to none of the other members. No one knew how it got there. Obmatoki were widely used among soldiers in the 1940s, but were used primarily by prisoners in the gulags after the Second World War, not the public. Later, it mysteriously vanished from the evidence room. The altercation theories are complicated for another reason. With the superficial descriptions, poorly done investigation, and omitted details from both the autopsies and the reports, some experts believe the bodies should be exhumed and subjected to a full autopsy again. Zolotaryov's body actually was exhumed in 2018, but there were contradictory results from this investigation. And oddly, his DNA didn't match that of any of his surviving relatives, though the skull definitely matched the post-war photographs of Zolotaryov. Most of the other theories involving an altercation involve Zolotaryov, but not in the role of a victim like the others. Remember, Zolotaryov was over a decade older than his fellow hikers and had fought in World War II. Some theorize that the man accompanying the hikers was not Zolotaryov at all. In fact, some suspect Zolotaryov had died long before he joined the hikers, and that someone was pretending to be him. But whether the man that died that day was Zolotaryov or not is, for the most part, immaterial to the theories that vilify him. Claims that Zolotaryov had a meltdown lack evidence, but they still exist and are worth noting. Some suspect he broke down during the hike. Perhaps an argument with another member of the group set him off, and he killed the others and staged it as an accident. But if you recall, Zolotaryov died embracing Kolevatov, his chest crushed and a piece of paper and pen held in one hand. That doesn't quite line up with the theory that he killed the others. Up until this point, you'll notice that the theories have been relatively tame. Most of these options are plausible, and some part of the case or another does support them. But this is Russia we're talking about, a country where more than 50% of the population genuinely believes that the Apollo moon landing was a hoax. Did you really think they'd be lacking creativity? Let's return to Zolotaryov for a second. Some suspect that he, Kolevatov, and Krivonishenko were actually KGB agents hired to either deliver fake proof of clothes tainted by radioactivity and take photographs of the American CIA agents they were meeting with. Something went wrong, and the Americans killed them and staged it as a tragic accident. This theory provides a somewhat logical explanation for several odd components of the story, like the radioactive clothes and the use of radiation detectors, the missing shoes and outerwear, and cameras that were never recovered from the pass. Zolotaryov also had an odd tattoo without translation, and he also hadn't just fought during World War II. It was found that he'd fought for the NKVD as well. That is, the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, the ministry that handled both police work and oversight of prisons and labor camps in the Soviet Union. Kolevatov had transferred from Moscow to the Urals Polytechnic Institute a few years prior, where he had worked as a laboratory assistant in a top-secret facility. Krivonishenko, too, had worked at a secret facility in Chelyabinsk 40, where a massive nuclear disaster had occurred in 1957. The theory states that the three didn't meet coincidentally. Instead, they were planted together and joined the group to meet with CIA agents on February 1st. The Americans massacred the group and left the bodies when things went awry. Allegedly, of course. Another theory alleges that the group mistakenly found a military testing area. The group could have fled, terrified by the sounds of explosions, or they could have been killed by Soviet soldiers guarding the area. The missing camera, theorists say, had photos of a military helicopter and the officers that were using it illegally. Supposedly, Dyatlov and Zolotaryov were aiding the KGB in documenting the officers using the helicopter, but they were caught. Dyatlov at one point actually took the group on an odd path off the trail before returning to it, and on February 1st, the military men found their camp. They had planned to kill Zolotaryov and Dyatlov without leaving marks, but the group resisted, and they had to kill the entire group. They rearranged the scene and cleaned up their tracks with skis before leaving the bodies to be found. Alexander Galikov, who presented this theory in 2011, felt that Lev Ivanov, one of the men in charge of the investigation, knew how it had happened and who did it, but he had no proof of this that I could find. Not long later, he was ordered to close the case. Some suspect military testing is to blame, that perhaps there were secret tests or launches that the hikers witnessed by mistake. Similar to the previous theory, the KGB and the military were both involved. Others think that infrasound led to psychological discomfort. The noises, which are too low for humans to hear, could have been unsettling enough to throw off the hikers and lead to some sort of an accident. Some scientists believe that infrasound wasn't to blame at all. Instead, that the trek was poorly timed, and they reached this area during a gravitational fluctuation. Gravity decreased that night, lifting them off the ground, and in a panic, they pushed through the tent to get out. The pressure in their bodies caused by the difference in gravity led to inexplicable internal injuries, killing them all. This phenomenon would have lasted only a few minutes, which was enough time to throw them up to 1.5 kilometers. Many of their injuries came from the fall as the corridor closed and gravity returned to normal. There's no way to know when this corridor could open again, leading to a similar occurrence, only that it's likely to. Another theory is probably the most stereotypical of any of these, and that's that UFOs are to blame. Yes, you heard me correctly. Aliens killed the Dyatlov 9. Allegedly. Okay, so maybe not aliens. Some say that it could be a meteorite or some other extraterrestrial phenomenon, but some suspect it was actually aliens that did it. According to members of the search team, they witnessed what they referred to as a fireball in the sky that put off no light. They say that it was certainly not the moon, and that it floated across the sky and disappeared over the horizon. There may have been a few sightings, but it's hard to be certain. Supposedly, these sightings were intentionally underreported during the investigation because there was no explanation for the lights, though some suspect that there's an actual UFO-related conspiracy that concerns more than just the hikers. Lev Ivanov is one of the most notable proponents of this theory, and he believed that it caused their deaths by emitting a beam of unspecified energy towards them, leading to the state in which the hikers were found. But because there were no witnesses to the events that occurred on February 1st of 1959, no one can say for certain what occurred. We can only guess. There's no way to be certain of the details of what happened on the night of February 1st. All we have are declassified documents, the testimonies of search party members, and more than a handful of theories to go off of. And evidently, that isn't nearly enough to come to a conclusion. It seems we'll never know the answer, if there even is one. If you've made it to this point in the video, let me know what theory you think is the best explanation in the comments below. Personally, I think it would have to be some combination of at least 2 to fill in all the gaps in the story, but I'd like to hear your thoughts. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you later.